There is a part of Nolan Wells that never made it back to the doctor his parents trusted to examine him. Not evidence, not a finding, a part of him. His throat, the structures inside it, weren't there when his body reached Washington for the second exam his family had fought to get. Sit with that for a second before we go any further, not because it's shocking for its own sake, but because of what it quietly closes off. On Wednesday, standing at a podium in Chicago, attorney Ben Crump read that detail aloud from the preliminary report, and it wasn't buried somewhere in the middle. It was the very first limitation the pathologist listed. Before red discoloration, before an undetermined cause of death, before anything else this update reveals, there was this. The one part of Nolan's body that might have told his parents the most had already been taken out of their reach before they ever got the chance to look. Why does that matter to people who aren't forensic pathologists, who don't spend their lives reading autopsy reports? Because it means that whatever answer this family eventually gets, it will never come from that part of the story. Not because no one wanted to look, because there was nothing left in front of the doctor to examine. For a mother who has already spent 3 weeks fighting for a complete picture of what happened to her son, that's not a technical footnote. That's one more door closing before she ever got to walk through it. Here's what this channel is, and just as importantly, what it isn't, in case you're joining us for the first time tonight. We don't dramatize. We don't sit inside a silence and fill it with a guess just because a guess feels more satisfying than uncertainty. If something comes from a sheriff's office, we tell you that. If it comes from an attorney reading a medical report out loud, we tell you that too. Word for word what was actually said, nothing added. A young man is gone. His family buried him last week. 3 days later, they stood in front of cameras and released the first real medical findings this case has ever produced. Everything tonight comes from that and from reporting that's already been checked. If that's not the story you came for tonight, we understand completely. No hard feelings. For everyone staying, this case just moved for the first time in over 2 weeks, and we're going to walk through every piece of it, slowly, together. Let's go back to where this started, because you can't understand why one missing piece of tissue carries this much weight until you understand exactly what this family has already survived to get here. It was the 4th of July. Nolan, 18, freshly finished with his first year playing football at Southwest Mississippi Community College, went out to Horn Island with friends for the holiday. 10 miles of open water separate that island from the mainland. No shelters out there, no cell signal, just a long afternoon that was supposed to end the way every one of those afternoons ends, with everyone back on the boat, everyone home before dark. By evening, his friends were back on the mainland. Nolan wasn't. Think about that for a moment, not as a plot point, but as an actual afternoon. A group of friends pulling away from an island, and one of them simply not in the boat. 2 days later, a park ranger found a body in the water off the island's northwest shore. Within hours, Jackson County Sheriff John Letbetter stood in front of reporters and said investigators suspected drowning, no foul play identified, that Nolan had apparently chosen to stay behind a little longer after his friends headed back.
Here's why that early explanation mattered so much, and it isn't complicated. For most people, an official saying accident, nothing more to it, within hours of a body being found would sound like relief. For Christine Wells Wansley, it didn't. It's easy to hear an early statement like that a simple procedure, officials doing their job, moving quickly to reassure a frightened community. But imagine being the mother on the other end of it. Imagine hearing that your son's death has already been explained before you've even had the chance to ask a single question yourself. That's not reassurance. That's a door closing in front of you before you've been let inside the room. So she didn't accept it. And what she did next is the part of this story people rush past too quickly, because on paper it sounds like a logistical decision. It wasn't. In the days right after Nolan was found, this family was supposed to be doing one thing, planning a funeral. Instead, they made arrangements to have their son's body flown out of Mississippi entirely to Washington, D.C., so a forensic pathologist with no ties whatsoever to anyone involved in this case could look at what remained. Think about what that decision actually cost them. Every day spent arranging a second examination is a day spent not laying their son to rest. Every conversation about logistics and pathologists is a conversation a grieving mother shouldn't have had to have, in the middle of choosing a casket, in the middle of writing an obituary. They weren't chasing a different answer than the one they'd already been given. They were searching for a complete one, and they were willing to delay their own grief to get it. That's not a procedural choice. That's what it costs a parent to refuse to let a story end before it's actually finished. The doctor they turned to was Dr. Roger Mitchell, president of the National Medical Association and the former chief medical examiner of the entire District of Columbia. Decades of experience, no connection to Mississippi, no connection to anyone involved in this case, nothing to gain by leaning toward one conclusion or another. His job wasn't to confirm what this family suspected. It wasn't to confirm what officials had already said publicly either. His only job was to look at what was left and report exactly what it could and couldn't tell him. And on Wednesday, 3 weeks after Nolan disappeared, that's exactly what came back. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. Sit with that word for a second, because it's easy to let a word like undetermined slide right past you. It sounds neutral, almost bureaucratic. But remember what this family had already been told, within hours, before anyone had really looked. Accident, nothing more to it. Now, 3 weeks later, after everything this family put themselves through to get a second opinion, the honest answer is, we still don't know. Imagine hearing that after you've already heard the first version. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like being told the ground you were standing on for 3 weeks was never actually solid at all. The report did note one physical finding, an area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. No fractures, no lacerations, just discoloration. The kind of detail that on its own could mean almost anything, or could mean nothing. Dr. Mitchell didn't call it evidence of harm, and he didn't call it proof of anything. He noted carefully that a body can change enough by the time a second examination happens that bruising underneath the skin becomes difficult to read with any confidence. Why does that matter to someone who isn't a forensic pathologist? Because it means this family now has one more fact and almost no way to know what that fact actually means. That's its own particular kind of exhausting. Not silence exactly, something worse. A piece of information sitting right in front of you that refuses to resolve into an answer. Which brings us back to where we started tonight, the missing part of Nolan's neck. Dr. Mitchell wrote that receiving those structures would have been, in his own words, of the utmost importance in determining a cause and manner of death. Without them, he wrote, he could not rule out an injury to the neck as a possible contributor to Nolan's death. Read that again, slowly, because of exactly what it isn't saying. It isn't an accusation. Dr. Mitchell never claimed to know what happened to Nolan, and he was careful, deliberately careful, not to suggest otherwise. What he said is something quieter, and in its own way more painful. An entire category of possible answers is now permanently out of reach, not because he lacked the skill to look for them, but because there was nothing left in front of him to look at. For a family that flew their son's body across the country specifically so someone independent could examine everything, discovering that one of the most important pieces had already been decided for them before they ever had a say, is its own kind of loss, stacked on top of the one they're already carrying.
There's a reason that specific gap matters more than it might sound. When someone is found in water and drowning is suspected, confirming how that person actually entered the water becomes especially important.
and especially important for someone who, like Nolan, was known to be a strong swimmer. That single sentence quietly reframes everything. It's the difference between a story that ends in tragedy nobody could have stopped, and a story that still has real, unanswered steps in between. There was more the report couldn't reach. Dr. Mitchell noted he couldn't directly examine Nolan's airway and lungs for water, or his stomach for its contents, two of the most basic confirmations available in a case like this one. And the original toxicology results, the ones that might tell this family whether anything else was in Nolan's system that day, hadn't reached him by the time he finished writing. 3 separate gaps, 3 separate reasons this case still refuses to close. Not because no one is looking hard enough, because there is simply too much still missing to say anything with real certainty. It's easy at this point in a story like this one to start hearing all of this as clinical, a list of things a doctor did or didn't have access to. It isn't clinical. Every one of those gaps is a question this family will carry with them for the rest of their lives, regardless of what an official answer eventually says. A pathologist named Priya Banerjee, who had no involvement in this case but has performed second autopsies of her own, put it plainly afterward. A second exam, she said, always comes with an inherent limitation because a body that's already been examined once is never again going to be in the state an untouched body would be in. That's not a criticism of anyone in this case. It's simply what this family walked into the moment they made the decision to ask a second, independent question. And they made that decision anyway, fully aware of what it might not give them. There's a detail behind all of this that only became public this week, and it says something about how far Nolan's story has traveled beyond one family in Mississippi. Attorney Crump revealed that former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick paid for the independent autopsy. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Somewhere along the way, without this family asking for it, without anyone planning it, their private grief became something a much wider circle of people felt they had a personal stake in. That doesn't undo a single unanswered question in this case. But for a mother who has spent 3 weeks feeling like she was the only one demanding a complete answer, it's worth sitting with what it means to learn you were never carrying this entirely alone. Crump made the distinction on Wednesday that he's made every single time he's spoken for this family, and it's worth hearing exactly as he framed it, because it hasn't shifted once since day one. This is only one part of the puzzle, he said. Even with this much now public, there are still more questions here than there are answers. He isn't asking anyone to presume what happened. He's asking that nothing be decided until there's actually enough here to decide it. That distinction matters even more given where this story sits in a much larger, harder conversation that's followed it from the very beginning.
Nolan was, by reporting on this case, the only black member of his friend group on that boat trip, and the only one who didn't come home. That fact alone doesn't tell us what happened to him, but it's part of why this story reached the NAACP's National Convention stage in the first place, and part of a much larger, uncomfortable question a lot of people have been asking since July, one that reaches far beyond this one family. Why does the earliest version of events in cases like this one so often arrive before the investigation that should have come first? So here's where that leaves this case tonight, 3 weeks in. The state's own autopsy, completed July the 7th by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, still hasn't been made public. The Jackson County Coroner's Office says it's still waiting on toxicology results from that same office, results that can take weeks to complete. Until both of those finally surface, this case sits exactly where Dr. Mitchell's report left it on Wednesday. Undetermined, not closed, not explained, simply, honestly, unfinished. After this update went public, Christine said something that stayed with a lot of people following this case closely. It is her hope, she said, that local authorities do what they need to do. Having these preliminary results in hand, she said, and hearing nothing back from the people actually investigating her son's death is heartbreaking and concerning. Read that slowly, because underneath it is something simple and devastating at the same time. She isn't asking for a particular outcome. She's asking, 3 weeks later, simply to be answered by the people whose job it is to answer her.
At Nolan's funeral, before any of this week's findings were public, Christine said something that had nothing to do with autopsies or investigations at all. "Share his stories," she said. "Never stop saying his name. As long as we keep remembering him," she said, "his light will keep shining through all of us." Put those two moments next to each other for a second. One is a mother methodically, publicly fighting for answers that officials still haven't given her. The other is that same mother quietly asking that her son be remembered as more than an open case file, more than a name attached to an unresolved investigation. Both of those things are true about Christine Wells Wansley at exactly the same time. And honestly, that's why this story has held so many people who never met Nolan at all. So here's tonight, in full, a piece of him that never made it back for examination, a finding that can't rule anything in or out, a state report still sitting unreleased, toxicology still weeks away, and a family that now has more paperwork than they had a month ago, and still not the one thing they've been asking for since the 4th of July, a real answer. This isn't the end of Nolan Wells' story. If we're honest, it isn't even the middle of it yet. It's one more page in a case that keeps insisting, every time it looks close to settling, that there's more here than anyone's been allowed to see so far. Somewhere between what Dr. Mitchell's report could confirm and everything it couldn't, simply because the pieces weren't there for him to examine, is the truth this family is still waiting for. They didn't get it this week, but they're not stopping, and it doesn't look like anyone still watching is either. When the state's findings or the toxicology results finally surface, we'll be right back here to walk through exactly what they say.